Hello, here's a little bit more of Patterson Matchmakers. The next week went by, with Frank Adams still worried about his brother. Weekdays were fine, but at the weekends, Mitch Adams would disappear entirely, only to resurface on a Sunday evening, the worse for wear. After a couple of weeks went by of this behaviour, Frank decided to talk to Leanne. Knocking on the door of her flat, he got no answer. Jane opened her door. She didn't have college till later that afternoon, so was catching up on some revision. "Hi, Frank. Leanne took Charlie to the doctor's for his inoculation. You're welcome to come in and wait till she comes back, though the place is a mess." Frank smiled, nodded, and accepted the invitation. A few minutes later, Jane had made a cup of tea, and they were seated in the living room. Sipping his tea, Frank looked like a worried man. "Frank," said Jane tentatively, "you really all that worried about your Mitch?" Frank nodded. "Yeah, he's acting so weird. Not at all like the fella I know and love. And that Kenny is in it somewhere. I know her." "Is she really that dangerous?" asked Jane softly, swallowing. Frank nodded. "Oh, aye, I'm crazy with her. You know what a good lad he is, but when he's with her, he'll drink too much and get so depressed." Frank looked so worried that Jane got up and gave Frank a quick hug. She liked Frank, having seen a whole other side to him. He was clearly devoted to his brother. "You're a good girl," whispered Frank. Suddenly she was in his arms, and he was kissing her. She was kissing him back, until panicked she pulled away. "No, I don't think that's a good idea," said Jane, a little breathlessly. "Sorry," said Frank apologetically. "You're still stuck on that baby brother of mine." Jane nodded. "And you're still in love with Leanne." "Why can't we just all stop playing silly beggars and be happy?" said Frank sadly. Alas, Jane had to agree. This game of silly beggars wasn't fun any more, she thought, miserably. She patted his arms. "Things will turn out right, you'll see." Frank kissed her on the cheek. "Thanks for being there, Jane, love." The sound of a key in the door in the next flat alerted them to the fact that Leanne and her son were back. Leanne Adams had made good progress since being released from the hospital. Now she could get around with a walking stick. She was heard to joke about being like Hop-along Cassidy, as she was apt to put it. Jane wondered if she would ever really make good on her many threats to bang you two's heads together. Jane was taking Leanne out as a treat for her birthday. Frank was babysitting Charlie. "Now, here's the number of the restaurant. Here's the address. You got everything you need," said Leanne as she handed Frank the slips of papers. "Charlie and me will be fine, won't we, son?" said Frank as he bent down to give Charlie a kiss. Charlie was in his playpen, having great fun with a cardboard box he had found earlier. Jane and Leanne had arrived at the restaurant in town, a nice little eatery named Casa Italia. It was lunchtime, and the place was starting to get packed with office workers and the like. The noise of dozens of different conversations filtered through, an unfathomable melting pot of sounds and noises. Jane leaned her elbows on the table and with her head in her hand, staring nonchalantly into space. Leanne smiled. "Ever hear of the Kirby kiss, Mrs. Woman? 'Cause that's what you'll get if you don't cheer up. And don't tell me that you're not thinking of a certain dark-haired, hazel-eyed man, about 6'3", 'cause I know bloody well you are." Jane smiled. "That obvious, is it?" Jane nodded. "Like an open book." The girls were just finishing up dessert when Leanne's mobile phone started ringing. It was Frank. "Lee, I'm at the hospital. It's our kid. There's been an accident." "What hospital are you at?" "Me and Jane are on our way." "He's in for Zackley," came the reply. Leanne flipped her phone shut and looked up. "It's Mitch. He's had some sort of accident. He's in for Zackley." "Well," said Jane, standing up, "what the hell are we waiting for? Let's go." After getting to the hospital and going in the accident and emergency entrance, they caught sight of Frank in the waiting room. "Frank," called Leanne, "how is he? What happened?" "He came home paralytic about 6 o'clock this morning. We had a right row about it. I hate seeing him like this. Anyway, I made some lunch for us both. He stormed out, tripped on the front steps. God, he really cracked his head. He was out of it. It seemed hours before anyone came to tell them anything else. In reality, it was only half an hour. When a doctor did eventually come and called out, "Adams," everyone was out of their seats quicker than you could say Jack Robinson. "Hello," greeted the doctor, a tall, thin man whose wide-bridged nose looked like a beak. "Mr. Adams is still unconscious. However, he just has a concussion. There don't seem to be any other injuries. He should be fine. We'll just keep him in for a couple of days." "Can we see him?" asked Jane softly. The doctor nodded. "We're just settling him down. A nurse will come and fetch you when we're done." "Oh, thank God for that," gasped Leanne as she watched the doctor walk away. Jane sank down into a chair and started to cry. Leanne put an arm around her. "You daft beggar! Haven't I told you and told you? You two belong together." Just then a nurse appeared to take them to see Mitch. "Frank, you go first. I'll stay with Jane here." Frank nodded and followed the nurse. He came back 10 minutes later, looking slightly pale. Leanne looked at him concernedly. "He is all right, isn't he?" She was still holding on to Jane, who had only just stopped sobbing. "Yeah, they say he'll be all right, but he was just lying there, so still. It was horrible." Leanne and Jane were allowed in next. He was in a ward, but the curtains around his bed had been closed. Leanne took a seat and Jane perched at the end of the bed. Blood matted Mitch's lovely dark hair, and there was a big bruise above his left eye. A big plaster covered his forehead. Jane took one limp hand and sighed. "Aren't we a pair of daft beggars, hey?" Leanne, realising that Jane wanted a few minutes alone with Mitch, got up. "I'll go and see if I can scrounge us a couple of cups of coffee," she said, walking towards the nurse's station. Jane looked back toward the bed, a lone tear falling down her cheek. "You are a daft beggar, make no mistake about it, and so am I. I just want you to know I'm so sorry for having the stupid argument in the first place, and I love you." She nearly rose into the air when a voice said, "I am not a daft beggar, and by the way, I love you too." Jane looked up. Mitch was squinting up at her, his eyes opened just enough for a glimpse of the hazel orbs. "First of all, you cheeky sod, don't give me scares like that. And how long were you listening?" laughed Jane, trying her hardest at being annoyed but not succeeding. "Oh, don't be annoyed. My head hurts like hell." Jane laughed again. "Is that because you cracked your head open? Or perhaps because you got paralytic last night?" Mitch merely grinned. Jane softly brushed the dark hair back from his forehead. "Does this mean that we can—" Jane planted a kiss on his forehead to silence him. "It means, Milado, that once you're better, we'll talk about maybe getting back to the way things were." The grin he gave her was watery but sincere. He was tired and his eyes kept closing. Jane gently stroked his hair until he fell asleep. Leanne returned with the coffees. "How is he?" she asked, handing a cup to Jane and sitting down in the chair again, hanging her walking stick over the arm. Jane nodded. "He came to, briefly. He's sleeping now." Leanne looked at her quizzically. Jane took a sip of coffee and rolled her eyes. "Don't play silly beggars, Leanne. It doesn't become you. But yes, I think we can work things out." Leanne grinned. Jane despaired of her sometimes. Maybe there was something of the hopeless romantic in her, or just maybe she got a gut feeling about something and followed it. Whatever it was, it made being her friend both exhausting and a pleasure. Half Spanish, half Italian, and yet all Scouse from her head down to her toes. The girls went to find Frank and go home, weary but relieved.